Let's start talking about Vietnam. So Vietnam is one of those wars that it still lingers so much in the American mindset. Many of you who are watching might have grandparents who were Vietnam War veterans, which I think is interesting because it shows a little bit of a generational gap. Because my grandparents were World War II generation folks, but the older I get, obviously, the younger generations I have found have less ties to World War II and many more ties to Vietnam. And so I think it's important to really lay out how long America was involved in Vietnam, because American involvement in Vietnam goes all the way back really to the end of World War II, in fact, till 1945. And there is a tons of books that talk about Vietnam, and I call it on the outline here an extended disaster. And I say extended disaster because we'd been there for so long, since 1945. But many historians, many military scholars argue that Vietnam was the greatest strategic disaster in American history ever. Greatest strategic disaster that we ever did, that ever happened. Now, there are various reasons for why they think that was the case. Some believe that that the political leadership hamstrung the military leadership. Some believe that it was a failure to have like a really firm idea of what we were doing in Vietnam. Some believe that it was the fact that the economy by the 1970s was starting to slow down. Perhaps there are so many reasons why people have argued that the Vietnam War was this great strategic disaster. But we're going to talk about one of the biggest problems in Vietnam was a failure of understanding. America went into the war with the perception of, we're going to do this one thing. Like, we're going to defend democracy, right? We're going to prevent the spread of communism. That was really why America was in Vietnam to begin with, was to prevent the spread of communism. However, to the Vietnamese, there was a perception that the U.S. was doing something entirely different, whether that was, building up this like South Vietnamese state or whatever. There was a difference in perspective as to what the Americans thought they were doing and what the Vietnamese thought America was doing. And that leads to problems, right? If you've ever... the best kind of example I can give with this is if you're writing something and you've kind of told the editor what you're going to write, but the editor thinks you're going to write something else, you're going to have problems working with that editor because you're both coming at the piece, the writing, from different angles. And so the reality is that America thought it was trying to build a non-communist nation in South Vietnam. That's what America set out to do, was to prevent the spread of communism. But for many people living in Vietnam, they saw the U.S. as just replacing French imperialism, right? They didn't look at the U.S. as some sort of savior. Instead, they really looked at America as just another imperial power trying to control their own country. So let's talk about the history of Vietnam, because in order to understand why America itself was so unpopular in Vietnam, you have to understand the kind of the recent history of the region, the Southeast Asia region. So here's the French Empire kind of at the height of its imperialism. This is probably like late 19th century, so like 1880s, 1890s. You can see that France had colonies in northern Africa, like Northwest Africa, and of course the colonies over here in Southeast Asia. To give you kind of a close-up on Southeast Asia, there you go. This is what the French called French Indochina. French Indochina. They had been in Vietnam essentially since the 17th century. So far back, way back when Europe was just first starting to explore the world, they had sent missionaries into Vietnam and to convert people to Catholicism. By the late 19th century, they had taken over other areas around Vietnam and ruled it as a colony. So from 1884 to about 1940, France ruled this area that they called Indochina, Southeast Asia. They ruled it as an imperial power, right? That this was a colony, and so they would extract wealth from this area and send it back to France. Now, during World War II, though, this is all going to change. World War II was a transformative moment for Southeast Asia because during World War II, the Japanese take over Southeast Asia and hold it for the duration of the war. So from 1940, 41, I think it's 41, from 1941 to 1945, Southeast Asia is controlled by Japan. They basically kicked the French out. And so after World War II is over, Japan is defeated. The question becomes, for many countries, what are we going to do with our colonies? And it's not just France either. England had colonies in Africa and the Middle East. France had colonies in Africa and Southeast Asia. America had colonies in the Pacific, like the Philippines. And the question for all of those countries is, do we keep our colonies or do we give them independence? And France has a prickly sense of pride. They didn't want to give up their status as a great power. And there was a push in France to maintain their empire, their colonies. However, at the same time, in Vietnam itself, there was an independence movement building, led by this man whose name is Ho Chi Minh. During World War II, Ho Chi Minh was a leader of one of the communist guerrilla factions. He was a communist leader. The communists were basically the fighter. They fought against the Japanese during World War II. And during the war, Ho Chi Minh had written a Declaration of Independence that was released basically immediately after the war was over. Literally, the war with Japan ended on August 9th. Ho Chi Minh wrote the Declaration of Independence and released it less than a month later in September. And so Ho Chi Minh is declaring independence from France, right? Not from Japan, but from France. So, and here's the interesting thing about the Declaration of Independence is you will definitely recognize some language here. All men are created equal, it says. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he says, this immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States in 1776. In a broader sense, this means all the peoples on the earth are equal from birth. All the peoples have a right to live, to be happy and free. The Declaration of the French Revolution, made in 1791 on the rights of man and the citizen, also states, all men are born free and with equal rights, and must always remain free and have equal rights. Those are unalienable truths. Now here's the important bit. Ho Chi Minh says, nevertheless, for more than 80 years, the French imperialists, abusing the standard of liberty, equality, and fraternity, have violated our fatherland and oppressed our fellow citizens. They have acted contrary to the ideals of humanity and justice. So, Vietnam is basically taking Western language, right? They're taking the language of the French Revolution, of the American Revolution, and saying these ideas apply to us too. They were saying these ideas apply to us too, and we deserve the rights of citizens. We deserve the right to self-government, right, to sovereignty, and thus, like, Ho Chi Minh and the communists were essentially throwing off the chains of imperialism. They're saying, like, look, we're not going to be beholden to your empire any longer, right? We're going to do our own thing. Now, this is all fine and good, but remember, and I keep returning to it, that you have to keep in mind that Cold War perspective, because from the perspective of the United States, this was a communist revolution, right? Ho Chi Minh was a communist, and he wanted to institute a communist government in Vietnam, and so the Americans are looking at this and like, I don't know about that, right? Remember the Cold War? They didn't want any more nations to turn communist. The whole goal of America's foreign policy after World War II was to contain communism. And so America kind of had a choice to make. Would they allow Vietnam to kind of decide their own fate? Or would they join forces with the French and try to keep Vietnam as a colony, right? Try to keep Vietnam as a French colony. They didn't want Vietnam to turn communist because that would have made more dominoes fall. Right? There was this whole theory in after World War II that is going to grow called the domino theory, where if you've ever stacked up dominoes in a line, you tip one over and the rest of them fall. That was the theory, right? Was that if you have too many dominoes lined up, particularly related to countries, right? If all these different countries are lined up, if Vietnam falls to communism, then that means Laos and Cambodia will also fall to communism, and it might influence the rest of the region. So America was, because of that Cold War mindset, didn't want to allow Vietnam to turn communist. And France, because they wanted to maintain their great power status, decides they want to keep Vietnam as a colony. So the U.S. decides to help them. The U.S. decides to help keep Vietnam as a French colony, and there's this whole war that gets fought over it, called the French Indochina War. It's a big war between France and basically this entire region of Southeast Asia, where they are fighting for control over this region to keep this region as a colony. America helped France a great deal in this war, particularly with money. After World War II, France was pretty well destroyed after World War II, and so America is going to help them a great deal with money to the tune of about $20 billion, which was a great deal of money back then. $20 billion today. Would have been $20 billion today, which still a lot of money. But if you think about this, right, how would this look to the Vietnamese people? Not only are the French trying to maintain their hold over, their own country, but now you have the Americans kind of funding it. And so to the Vietnamese, it very much seemed like America was no better than France, right? That they were just another imperial power trying to oppress the rights of the Vietnamese people. And what this is going to do is, when the Vietnam War starts, it's going to give Ho Chi Minh a lot of political ammunition to use against the United States. Right, he will criticize the United States as just a replacement for France, right? Another imperial power coming over here to try to keep our people oppressed. The Indochina War is in the early 1950s. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it, but I do want to talk about the battle that kind of ends the First Indochina War, which is the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which I'm sorry, I'm sure I'm just butchering the pronunciation here. But the Battle of Dien Bien Phu is way up here in North Vietnam, or what will become North Vietnam, which was heavily controlled by the communists at this point in time. The battle was over a French base up in the mountains up in North Vietnam. France is going to lose this battle, despite America tried to help. They tried to help parachute troopers in. They sent supply planes in, but none of it worked. France is going to lose that battle. And it becomes this embarrassing moment for the French. There's all these newspaper headlines called La Mort de France, and it's that, which means the death of France, right? Just that France had taken this blow to its stature, right? That it couldn't even hold on to its colonies anymore. Every empire has this moment where they realize that they're not powerful enough to hold on to their colonies, and this was that moment for France. After this battle, France decides it's not worth to keep Vietnam, right? It's too expensive. We don't have the power. We're not powerful enough to maintain our hold on Vietnam. So they decided to back out. They're like, all right, we're gonna give up Vietnam, and this puts America in a really weird position, because America had been backing the French, and America didn't want Vietnam to turn communist. With France backing out, it certainly seemed like France would turn communist. And so there was this fear in the United States, what are we going to do? Do we back out with the French and basically allow France to turn communist? That seemed like a really bad idea. You guys might remember that in 1949, when China turned communist, that became political ammunition in the United States to hurt Harry Truman. Well, during this time period, Dwight Eisenhower was president, and he didn't want to be tarred as the guy who lost Vietnam. And so, if the United States backed out, would there be a backlash at home? Was the United States willing to fight for Vietnam? And so, there were all these questions that are going to come up And America is going to be wrangling through them for a few years. One of the big questions is, what are the boundaries of Vietnam going to look like? Is the whole country going to be unified? Is it going to be separated? Is it going to be 3 or 4 different countries? Because if you look at this picture, the boundaries of French Indochina include more than just Vietnam, right? There's multiple countries in there. And this, of course, is just a map of what will become Vietnam. So in order to settle all of this, in order to settle, the French leaving and the Vietnamese kind of taking over at least parts of their own sovereignty, they have this big meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, where they're going to sign something that becomes known as the Geneva Accords. An accord is just an agreement. Just basically they signed an agreement in Geneva in 1954. So this is the Geneva Accords is the agreement that ends that Indochina War. What the Geneva Accords do is essentially grant Vietnam independence. They grant Vietnam independence, but there's a huge catch. There's a huge catch here. So Vietnam is going to be independent, but it's going to be divided. Just like with the Korean Peninsula, which was a disaster, they're going to do that same thing again. They're going to divide Vietnam into a north and southern region. You can see the World War II mentality kind of seeping in here. Right? Remember after World War II, the Allied nations divided up Germany and tried to rebuild Germany in like their own little sectors. That was a disaster. They tried to do the same thing in Korea. That was a disaster. And yet here we are, same relative time period, and they're like, what, let's try it again. Let's do this again. So they divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, which is right here, into 2 parts. The northern section is going to be dominated by the communists. The southern section is kind of up for grabs. It's mostly going to be controlled by the United States. They're going to try to build up a real, like a stable government in South Vietnam. So here's the thing. They divided South Vietnam in 1954 and said 2 years later, in 1956, there's going to be an election. And whoever wins, we're going to unify Vietnam under that person's leadership. So the U.S. basically had 2 years to find somebody who could beat Ho Chi Minh in an election. That was going to be tough to do. Ho Chi Minh was incredibly popular, particularly because he had fought against the Japanese in World War II. He's the guy who, helped put together the Declaration of Independence in Vietnam. So there was this sense that we have to find a really popular figure who will be able to beat Ho Chi Minh in 1956. And so America's goal over the next 2 years is going to be to build up South Vietnam into a credible government under the leadership of a popular person. That was their goal. It's also worth noting that the United States did not sign the Geneva Accords. And you are already in the back of your mind, I'm sure you're going, oh man, like here we go. Because this is going to set up some treachery later on. America decides not to sign the Geneva Accords because they don't want to be held accountable to them. And they are going to go against the Geneva Accords in a couple of years. We'll find out why here in just a second. So, the United States needed somebody who was popular. They needed somebody who could win an election. And the guy they chose was this man right here. This man's name is Ngo Dinh Diem. This bit down here is how most people write it in terms of like writing it in English. You can see it also over here in the in my outline there. Diem was chosen to lead the new government of South Vietnam. He was chosen by the United States. This was their guy. And you may be asking, why? Why did they choose this guy? What makes this guy special? What makes this guy the person the U.S. was willing to back? So there's a few reasons. Why did the U.S. choose Diem? Partly it's because he was very anti-communist, which was really important for the United States, right? They wanted somebody who was an anti-communist, who wouldn't be willing to work with communists. That was very important. Additionally, Diem had ties to the United States itself. He had spent time studying in the U.S. He had come over to America and given and had speaking engagements in the United States. He had friends in the American government, and so Diem was pretty well connected. Also a benefit for him. The truth is, though, is that the United States didn't really have a better alternative than Diem. He was the best one the U.S. had, because most of the other credible leadership was usually sided with Ho Chi Minh, and so this was the guy the U.S. had to back. Right, this was their best shot. However, there was one big glaring problem with Diem, and that is the fact that he was Catholic. Now, being Catholic is not a problem, but being Catholic in a nation that is traditionally Buddhist or Taoist or Confucian can be complex. It can be a challenge, if you will, because Diem was basically going to be the leader of a country that did not agree with his religious ideologies. And that's going to create issues here in a bit, because Diem is going to try to make Catholicism kind of the state religion, which is going to complicate things greatly for his government. So, here's Diem. He has 2 years to try to build up a stable government. From 1954 to 1956, Diem is trying to build up a government in South Vietnam that can win that election in 1956. He is entirely unsuccessful in this. Diem's attempt to build up a government unravels so quickly. He is not a very popular man, partially because of the religious differences, but also because he kind of ruled like a dictator. He was in some ways kind of a strong man. He didn't like popular disruption, popular protests, right? So when people would protest him, he would use the police to put down the protests, which of course is going to beget more protests. And so basically, Diem, who's supposed to be the leader of the democratic part of Vietnam, turns South Vietnam into like this quasi-police state. He starts rounding up communists. Basically people who he didn't like, he'd start rounding them up and throwing them in prison. Some of these people ended up killed. And so, South Vietnam just turns into this, it is chaos, thrown into chaos. And when the elections come in 1956, the Americans know, there's no doubt that Ho Chi Minh is going to win. Diem is not popular. He has no chance to win that election to reunify Vietnam, and so the U.S. pulls out and says, you know what, we're not going to hold these elections. South Vietnam is going to be a permanent country. So Diem and the U.S. refuse to participate, and they basically turn South Vietnam into a permanent country separated from North Vietnam. All this does is it gives Diem more latitude to rule with an iron fist. In particular, Diem is going to turn against the religious majorities in the country. Remember, he is a Catholic, which was the minority religion in Vietnam. But because of his power, he is able to crack down on Buddhist monks in particular. And one day, in an effort, so Diem, after they called off the elections in '56, Diem keeps power for years, up until the early 1960s. And in 1963, there was a very, very famous event, and I'm going to show you a picture of it in just a second, where a Buddhist monk decides to protest Diem's leadership in a way that most people had never seen before. Now, if you're squeamish about pictures that are a little violent, quite or gruesome, you might not want to look at the next picture, but I'm sure many of you have already seen this picture. It has graced the cover of Rage Against the Machine's very first album. This is the image right here. So you may be looking at this and wondering what the hell is happening in this image. So on June 11th, 1963, so we're in the midsummer, it's hot, and a Buddhist monk by the name of Thich Quang Duc, this man right here, walked into the middle of a busy intersection right in the middle of Saigon, one of the biggest cities in South Vietnam. He sat in I believe the lotus position, which was a meditative position for the Buddhist monks. he and his some of his helpers poured gasoline on him, and then he himself lit the match and lit himself on fire. Of course, he dies, right? Thich Quang Duc dies there in the street. According to the people who witnessed this, there was a media member there who took this picture, and according to the people who were present, Thich Quang Duc never said a word, never screamed, never uttered a single sound. He just died silently, burning to death in the street. This picture made its way all around the world, and we'll talk about that in a second. We'll talk about the international response to this. Let's talk about how the South Vietnamese government responded to it first. So what Thich Quang Duc is protesting is Diem's leadership. He's protesting against Diem's crackdown against religious freedom in South Vietnam. And the way the Diem administration responded to this shows how out of touch they were. This incident showed that Diem had alienated his own people to the point where they were literally willing to light themselves on fire to protest his government. But so there was this person in South Vietnam. Her name was Madame Nhu. Madame Nhu was kind of like the quasi first lady of South Vietnam. Diem himself wasn't married, so he didn't have a first lady. But Madame Nhu, I think, was his sister-in-law, and she was kind of considered the honorable, the first lady, because Diem didn't have a wife. And she made a statement after this event that showed how out of touch and how callous the South Vietnamese government was. So when she first heard of this event and saw pictures of it, she said that she would clap hands at seeing another monk barbecue show. Just like unbelievable callousness, right? This idea that like, yeah, you guys can burn yourself, we don't care. In fact, I will clap for you if you keep burning yourself. And the thing is, people did. Thich Quang Duc is not the only person who burned himself alive in South Vietnam to protest Diem's leadership. More people started doing this. On the other side of the world, in the United States, John F. Kennedy saw this picture on the front page of the New York Times and was just like, what is going on in South Vietnam? Right? John F. Kennedy was like, what is happening over there in South Vietnam? The U.S. at this point in the early 60s had already started sending troops to South Vietnam, just a few thousand, and most of the troops that had been sent by John F. Kennedy at this point were, I don't want to say peacekeepers, but they were more so like strategists, people like trainers, this kind of thing. So in the early 60s, America was already sending troops to kind of support the Diem government. But when John F. Kennedy saw this picture, he was like, what is happening over in South Vietnam? Like, this is unacceptable. Later on, John F. Kennedy would say that no picture had ever generated so much emotion throughout the world as that one. Up to this point, the United States, of course, had supported Diem to the hilt, right? They had funded Diem, they had stood by Diem when he would have lost the election in '56. They made the move to basically put Diem in charge of South Vietnam, and they had stood beside him for, almost 10 years at this point. But that moment broke Kennedy's resolve in terms of standing by Diem. After the monk protests, there was this move amongst the South Vietnamese military to get rid of Diem. And so it was kind of up to the American government, do they want to step in? People were asking, the CIA, I believe was who it was, got wind that the government was planning on getting rid of Diem. And the question became for John F. Kennedy, do we want to do something about this? Do we want to try to stop it? And ultimately the answer was no. So in early November of 1963, Diem is assassinated by his own military leadership. Again, I'm going to show you a picture of a dead body, so if that makes you squeamish, don't look. But here is Diem, who has been unceremoniously assassinated in the back of a car by his own military leadership. John F. Kennedy decided not to step in because he believed it would not be that that it would have created more problems to keep propping Diem up than to allow him to be assassinated. But, history has a weird way of coincidence sometimes. 3 weeks later, after Diem is assassinated, John F. Kennedy is assassinated. So literally, November 2nd was when Diem was assassinated, and 3 weeks later, John F. Kennedy is in Dallas, Texas, going through, he's campaigning in Dallas, trying to drum up support in a southern state, Texas, that he needed to win in order to become president again. So he was going through Texas, he was going through Dallas, he was on this, he was in an open top car, so he's in a convertible. There he is, smiling. This is his wife, Jackie Onassis, Jacqueline Kennedy, as she was known at the time. This is Texas Governor John Connally, who was in the car with him. So there's all these. This is a big deal, right? The president coming to Dallas, and on this day, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, shot 3 times by a man named Lee Harvey Oswald. It killed him, right? They rushed him to the hospital, but the wounds were far too bad to live through. And so when Kennedy's assassinated, Lyndon Johnson takes power. So Kennedy does not get to see the Vietnam War through. That responsibility will turn over to Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson is a interesting person. I'm going to spend a few minutes kind of talking about Johnson and his personality. Johnson is the only Texan to ever become president. Now, some people might say, like, what about the Bushes, George and George, right? They were both Texans. Were they? Lyndon Johnson was actually born in Texas. George H.W. Bush was born in Massachusetts and went to Yale. George W. Bush was born in Connecticut and went to Yale. Lyndon Johnson is the only native Texan to become president. He was born in what is nowadays Johnson City, I think, and he attended back then what was called Southwest Teachers College or Southwest Texas Teachers College. It became Southwest Texas University, and nowadays is called Texas State University. But so Lyndon Johnson, he was a Texan, and he was a very forceful politician. Johnson was famous for being able to push difficult bills through Congress. You may remember him for signing the Civil Rights Act that we talked about last time, which was a difficult bill to get signed. Johnson had a way of basically calling in favors, of wrangling people. He had this very famous thing that he would do called the Johnson treatment, and you can see it here on the right. Johnson was a tall man. He was like 6'4", built like a linebacker kind of guy, just a big dude. And he had this way of kind of intimidating people, but not always by being mean, just by like invading their personal space. So you can see that it goes 1, 2, 3, 4 here. And you can see it like, over the course of this conversation, how Johnson is just slowly leaning in. Like here he's just talking normally, and now he's like shaking his finger at him, and then he's like leaning in and cajoling him, and now here he is leaning in, and this dude is like leaning back, right? This guy is like actively trying to get out of out of Johnson's way. Johnson had this fantastic way of being this dominant force in politics. He was he is widely considered the most powerful Senate Majority Leader of all time, or at least in the 20th century, because of his ability to push difficult bills through Congress, like the Civil Rights Act, or many of the things that they passed in the 1950s through Johnson's Senate. But now, Johnson is now no longer in the Senate. In 1960, when John F. Kennedy ran for president, he selected Johnson to be his vice president, because Johnson was from Texas and Kennedy was from Massachusetts. Kennedy wanted to kind of like shore up the Southern vote. So he chose Johnson. And Johnson, now with Kennedy being assassinated, Johnson's in charge of the presidency. And he's also now inherited the Vietnam War, which kind of made Johnson uncomfortable. Johnson, I think, always felt more at home in the Senate, where he could work together with 100 other people. Whereas when you're president, it can be a very isolating thing. Like, you have advisors and stuff, but ultimately the decisions come down to you. So Johnson is now in charge of the Vietnam War, and at one point in his political career, he had promised not to, and this is a direct quote, he said, "I will not send American boys 9,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." Right, so Johnson at one point had said, like, we're not going to widen the war in Vietnam. But when he becomes president, he's going to turn back on that promise. In 1964, just a few months after Johnson had taken power, there was an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is up here. You can see I've got the red box around it. The Gulf of Tonkin is a body of water that was at the time controlled by North Vietnam. This is, of course, North Vietnam up here in this region. And this area right here along the coastline was controlled by North Vietnam, but this area out here in like the middle of the Gulf was what is considered international waters, right, where anybody can be. And there was an incident in early August of 1964 where purportedly there was gunfire, like American ships were shot at by some North Vietnamese vessels. In fact, there were 2 incidents reported on this day, or one was on August 2nd, one was on August 4th. The one on August 2nd we know happened, right? That there was a legit gunfire battle between an American ship and a Vietnamese ship. But then 2 days later, they say a second attack happened. This time, that attack was pretty dubious. Even the commander of the boat said that he didn't think an attack happened. The North Vietnamese government said that we didn't do anything, there was no attack. But the Pacific commander said that one happened, and LBJ believed him. Nowadays, modern historians look at this incident and call it the Gulf of Tonkin, like the Tonkin Gulf incident, and say that this was a pretext to going to war. Right, that this was an event that was contrived, that was made up, right? That the government kind of invented to give a reason to go to war. When LBJ goes on TV after the Gulf of Tonkin incident and rages about North Vietnam as this aggressive nation, and he demands the power to be able to deal with this problem. And so Congress passes what becomes known as the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, where they basically hand Johnson a blank check. They're just like, look, yeah, we're going to give you all the power that you need. Do whatever you feel like you got to do. They basically said that they gave Johnson all power to deal with the war in Vietnam, and which essentially took away congressional oversight. According to the Constitution, if you want to declare war, you have to go through Congress. Well, the Gulf of Tonkin resolutions took that away and said that Johnson had full capability to do whatever he felt was necessary in Vietnam. We already talked about the domino theory, so I'm going to skip that. And what's going to happen after the Tonkin Gulf resolution is that Johnson is going to escalate the war. Remember that we talked about the domino theory. I'll flip back to this. That there was this fear that if the U.S. didn't stop South Vietnam from turning communist, that all these other countries that were next to it, like Cambodia, Laos, and you can see in this final domino just says rest of Southeast Asia. That if they didn't stop South Vietnam from turning communist, that all these other dominoes would fall. And so the U.S. felt compelled, because of that Cold War mindset, to stop Vietnam from turning communist, which meant they had to defend South Vietnam. And in Johnson's mind, the only way to do this was by sending a lot of troops. So from 1965, you can see right here that this is the era I was talking about with LBJ. When LBJ was president, we had just a very small amount of forces there. But after the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, 1964, you see the escalation start to the point where by 1968, we have over 500,000 troops in South Vietnam. were dropping bombs in South Vietnam. In fact, there were bombing campaigns. There was one called Operation, you don't need to know this, but there was one called Operation Rolling Thunder, where the U.S. dropped more bombs on Vietnam than all of the Allies in World War II combined. Meaning, like, the French, the British, and the Americans, like, we dropped more bombs on Vietnam than all three of those countries in World War II combined. Which is crazy. Think of how small Vietnam is. It's a very small country compared to Europe, right? The fact that we dropped more bombs on Vietnam is just like, is insane. And all those bombs are being dropped on North Vietnam, right? Like, which is even smaller than just, it's what, one part of Vietnam. It's just crazy. But here's the problem. Here's the problem for the United States. Is that the U.S. is trying to needs to convince the Vietnamese people that we're the good guys, right? That the United States is the good guys. But these bombing campaigns and this massive show of force undermines that idea. More and more Vietnamese people become convinced that really the Americans are the problem, right? That the Americans are no better than the French imperialists were, 20, 30 years ago. And so because of the bombing campaigns are going to kill a great deal of civilians, the American troops that are coming in are going to disrupt life for, civilian populations. And over time, resentment is going to grow in Vietnam, not just in North Vietnam, who is actively at war with South Vietnam, but there's going to be resentment in South Vietnam too against American forces that are disrupting their life. Over time, the war in South Vietnam does not go very well. The American government is struggling to come up with a good strategy for winning the war in Vietnam. There are a lot of people who knew the war couldn't be won, because what they're trying to do is protect South Vietnam from turning communist, but they're not providing a stable government to convince people that that South Vietnam is going the right direction. South Vietnam was incredibly unstable. Diem had been assassinated. They essentially had like a military leadership. The U.S. was basically in charge of South Vietnam, and things weren't going very well. And so what's going to start happening, we'll skip the draft for now. What's going to start happening is that there is a credibility gap that is growing in the United States. Because what starts happening is the U.S. government has to lie about how things are going in Vietnam. Things aren't going very well, but if you listen to press coverage in the U.S., all the military generals, all of the leadership would say, oh, things are going really well in Vietnam, like we're so close to winning, like just, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel kind of thing. And the reality was that we weren't even close. Right, that the military leadership knew that we couldn't win. In fact, there was a whole, and we'll talk about this a little later in a different lecture, but there was a whole research project that was going on within the government that showed that the government knew we couldn't win Vietnam, but we stayed there anyway. And so there was this gap that was growing between what people believed was going on in Vietnam. Protests are growing in the United States because people didn't believe the government. So the government's telling us one thing, that the war is going well, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, but what people actually believed is starting to counter that. Many people in America are starting to question, are we doing the right thing? Are we in Vietnam for the right reasons? Should we be in Vietnam? And those questions are going to explode in the year 1968, because at the beginning of the year, a massive event happens called the Tet Offensive. Now, I'm going to actually stop here for the day.